This is an interview on September 27th, 1990 with Chauncey Alexander. The interview is being conducted by Frances Feldman in her office at USC. Chauncey, I remember that the first time we met, do you remember? You were a field work student at Family Service in Los Angeles. That must have been in the early 40s.
Yes, it was. It was about 41.
Yeah, and you were a social work student in the master's program at USC. What led you into the field of social work?
Well, I think there were two things. First, when I graduated from UCLA in summer of 1938, the dean of the sociology department, where I'd taken some courses, called me over and asked me what I was doing, and after I got out of school. And I said, well, I was going to look for a job. And he said, well, why don't you go down and apply for work at the State Relief Administration? They need social workers. I'll speak faster because that sounds awfully slow. And also, I'll tell you a funny incident connected with that.
Right.
Are you on now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I went down and applied for a job, and I was brought in for an interview. And I was interviewed. I had just graduated with a baccalaureate degree in psychology, and so I was interviewed by the woman who was later the director of Family Service Agency. Do you remember?
Blythe Francis?
Blythe Francis.
Uh-huh.
In the program. I'm pretty sure it was her.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, she asked me about experience and so forth, and all my experience had been in industry. I've been working my way through school. So she finally said, well, I don't think you've had enough experience in this relative to this field and so forth. I'm sorry about that. So I went home and I was very depressed because it was during the Depression. I was looking for a job, and my mother asked me, "What's the problem?" I said, "You seem kind of depressed." I told her the story. She says, "Well, we'll see about that." So she called up Supervisor Knudsen at the time. And he says, send him down to my office. So I go down to his office, and he kind of go in. He says,
Did you call him because she was a constituent?
Yes,
of his?
Because she knew him, and she was active in politics. So I went down to his office and talked to him, and he said, what is it you want to do? And I said, well, I think it'd be a nice, interesting job over here at the State Relief Administration. So he picks up the telephone. He calls over there. He says, now you go over there at such and such a time tomorrow. So I go over to State Relief Administration. I see Blythe Francis again, and she is very happy to have me there and wants to give me a job. And that's the way I got into social work, into the State Relief Administration.
Was that in Los Angeles?
Yes, downtown Los Angeles. And then I was assigned for a short time to a family service district in Pasadena.
Oh,
and then later was sent to Metro, Single Men's District. At any rate, and the second piece was, aside from, I think it was Olson in sociology, aside from that, I had some very strong social work supervisors down there. I wish I had looked up their names. One was Edith Reese. Do you remember Edith?
Yes.
And there was another one who had worked for Travelers Aid for many years. Big, tall, husky woman. both of them were very strong social work, and they immediately glommed onto me and said, you have to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what got me into social work.
Mm-hmm. And so you came to SC.
So I came to SC, and just took part-time courses, night courses, so forth,
Mm-hmm.
for a period of years. And then during that time, that was in '39 that I started, and then by 1941 I had a job at Patton State Hospital, so I was traveling back and forth there about 3 times a week from San Bernardino to night class.
That's where you lived, in San Bernardino?
I was living in San Bernardino for about a year and a half, and it was during that time that I was a field placement in the Family Service Agency with, all these names. The teacher, casework teacher, marvelous woman.
Oh, Ruby Inlow.
Ruby Inlow
Ruby
was my
Inlow.
supervisor,
Uh-huh.
so I was very lucky.
Yes, you were. Uh-huh.
So that was how I got into
Mhm.
social work.
Mhm.
And I just continued going to school part-time. Then during, I finished my AA the first year,
Mhm.
about 41, toward the end of 41 or 42, and then went into the Army.
Mhm.
So that's where I was at that time.
When you were in the Army, did you do anything connected with social work?
Oh, yes. The day I went into the Army, I was grabbed by a psychiatrist, Phil Shapiro, who was a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist in San Francisco, and he was a captain, and he saw my record of having worked for Patton State Hospital. So he immediately got hold of me, and I spent about a year and a half at Terminal Island on the induction center, and our job was to try to keep people who had problems out of the service.
Mhm.
So I spent time there. Subsequent to that time, then he and I both were transferred to set up a psychiatric reconditioning program at a camp outside of in Campo. It was the it was a psychiatric reconditioning hospital, and we set the whole thing up from start to finish.
What is a reconditioning hospital?
Well,
You get people who are misfits and you recondition them?
As a result, this was right at the African campaign. We had about 50% of casualties during that campaign, mentally ill and psychiatric casualties. And it was about the time that Bill Menninger came in and as the Surgeon General, and the Army set this up as the first center, and they would bring psychiatric casualties from all over the world into this center, both from the Pacific and from the...
Where was it located?
It was located in Campo, about 60 miles outside of San Diego.
Oh.
They picked the spot that was considered to have the most sunshine of any city in the any place in the United States. And it was a beautiful, lovely, former cavalry camp. And we converted it into a general hospital and a psychiatric hospital. And we had, so we set up a program there where, and I was classified as a psychiatric social worker. There was no military occupational specialty at the time, except for an MOS, or except as a psychiatric social worker, but they didn't have an official number attached to it. And I was assigned with him, and he and I set up the whole shooting match. I did most of the work because I knew administration and so forth. And we finally wound up with about 12 social workers and 3 or 4 psychologists and half a dozen psychiatrists on that. The reconditioning center was established to take men who were psychiatric casualties and recondition them for civilian life or to go back into the service. And we had a complete educational system there. They could graduate from high school or go to college. They imported a whole series of educators. We had art programs. We had physical and mental reconditioning, morale conditioning programs, a whole series of them.
How long did they stay on the average? Do you have any?
We developed an 8 weeks program, and which finally was very successful. And we did individual therapy, group therapy. We initiated a lot of new group therapy, which was just coming into play at that time. Narcosynthesis and so forth. I trained a lot of psychiatrists there. These 90-day wonders that they were getting through at the time. And we developed a whole reconditioning, psychiatric reconditioning program, a manual, which I sent to Bill Menninger, and they started to use some of that in their programs. It was an exciting and real adventure and tremendous training, because we were dealing with all kinds of psychiatric problems, each different depending on the theater that they came from.
What interests me about this, aside from its giving early promise of your organizational skills, is how much emphasis there was in that time on rehabilitation in terms of mental health.
Well, I was just starting at that time, and it was because of the crisis they had in the North African campaigns, you see, and that's why they started this in the Army. They had some of this type of work in the Air Force because of the selection problem. And it turned out that there were about 13 of us who were working as psychiatric social workers throughout the country. We developed a little core group that corresponded with one another. And the American Association of Psychiatric Social Workers developed a kind of a center for us, and community had bulletins that would come out sharing our experiences and so forth. People like Al Commoner and Whitman, and what's his name? A fellow at the University of Pennsylvania who was a big psychotherapist. Can't think of his name now, but a number of us were all corresponding with him. So we had organized quite a program. We had considerable adventures there. I don't know how much you want to get into these kind of things.
Yes,
we had
I think it's especially,
we had a revolt of the patients.
Yeah, it's especially relevant when you consider today's times and what's happening in the Middle East with American forces.
Well, we had a real problem there, because we had a psychopathic colonel who was in charge of the camp, and he was really...
And he wasn't a patient.
No, he was an old-time medical corps colonel and he was really a very sick man, and so he did all kinds of things that created problems with the patients, and we had to. We, in a sense, our whole operation was fighting to get a whole different concept in the Army about how you deal with people and how you rehabilitate people. we had a lot of old-time Army people who were assigned to do the administrative work. So we'd have situations like people be brought in from the Pacific right out of fighting, and they were supposed to get a 2-week immediate go-home program and then come back for reconditioning. And the people who were in administration would hold up their leave. So we'd have to go down and fight with the administrative staff on that kind of thing. I was fortunate that I had a old-time social worker or experienced social worker, Curly Wilson, who was one of the people who set up the Social Security programs in 11 Western states. And he had a lot of experience, knew everybody in the national, and he was a tremendous person and very principled. So between the two of us, we were constantly battling for these patients, and it was a battle against in effect against the administrative rigidity which the Army had, and they just didn't know how to deal with these kind of things. So I became very expert at the Army regulations, because I found that was the most important way to deal with them, was to make them live up to their own regulations. So that was an early lesson for me on how you use existing administrative procedures for the benefit of patients and clients. So that was a useful period. That program, I made lots of friends in the psychiatric field, and so when I came out of the service as a result of that, that's when I was hired as a research and public relations director for the Veteran Service Centers.
Was that in California?
That
too?
was in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles.
And we had 19 agencies located in one single place down at 3rd and Spring. You may remember that.
Yes, I do remember that.
And I didn't know a thing about public relations. But I was really hired because they wanted a social worker in the job who could kind of represent the United Way, or the Community Chest at the time, then Moet. They had Art Tryon, you may remember.
Oh,
Art,
yes, indeed.
who was the go-between the county and the veterans organizations. And, well, I made Art famous
as part of your public relations.
As part of my public relations. We did a lot of good things for veterans, and but I was able to use a lot of what I had learned in the first year, social work, to deal with a lot of the issues that we had there. And we were essentially advocates for the veterans, and we had to coordinate these 19 agencies that were located in the...
Wasn't that an early development of agencies collaborating in a single place on a particular client group?
And we eventually established 17 local centers in which the decentralized pieces of the various agencies, like the Family Service Agency or the Veterans Administration or the AFL-CIO, which had a big program for veterans, all the veterans organizations, and all the major agencies, were Red Cross and so forth, were located centrally, and then we also had locations out throughout Los Angeles County, about 17 locations, so it was a big operation. And I learned a great deal there about research, public relations, and politics. Because Tryon was an alcoholic and was really a low-level political hack. And so I learned a lot about the inside.
But he was a veteran, wasn't he?
Hmm?
But he was a veteran.
Oh yes, he had been a WPA crossing guard and had worked his way up in the veterans organizations, and so he was really in a way, kind of despicable figure. But he was, but I could use the implied influence of the community chest to get decent approaches, social approaches to how you dealt with veterans. And so it was a constant battle to, and they kept me only because I was good for them. I made the program visible, I made it nationally known, and as a consequence I was able to stay, plus Lynn Mowatt's influence. We got into problems, but we did a lot of marvelous things for veterans.
Lynn Mowat was then the director of the community chest.
Community chest, yes. And we initiated a number of programs. We got into such things as dealing with the housing problem for veterans. Veterans were being ripped off with all this cheap housing, and we had all kinds of problems like that. I learned a great deal from that. Because, one of the things we did was finally got a contact in the bureau, the state bureau that licenses contractors. So when we kept running into these problems of veterans buying houses, and then the porches would fall off and the roofs wouldn't come together, so forth, we'd report this over to this fellow who was a veteran, and he would really clamp down on these contractors, make them fulfill that. So we had a regular thing going. Say, every time we got a complaint, bingo, we'd get an answer to it, just like that, because we had a person that was favorable to veterans there. And finally got a big problem came in with one of the major developers, and I called over there and asked for this fellow, and he said, well, there was a different person in that position. And I said, well, I need your help. Here's the problem. He says, I can't help you. And I said, why not? And he says, well, we're just not doing that kind of thing. And I said, well, where is so-and-so? And he says, well, he's been assigned to Lancaster, which was Siberia, as far as that agency was concerned.
Because you've been giving too much help?
Right, exactly, because those are the kinds of things we ran into, and political problems. And veterans getting ripped off by car dealers, particularly. So we hired an investigator, and that's another technique I learned is get the information. And we hired an investigator, an old-timer who had been around City Hall for a long time. And we used to send him out he worked for me, and I'd send him out on missions to get the proper information and get things taken care of. And that was a very practical experience too. But we started a number of programs. I put together a listing of benefits in every state. I got the Los Angeles Examiner to finance that, and I dealt with the manager of the Examiner, and when we announced that, we had veterans lined up around 2 blocks looking for that kind of information. And so it gave, and then we had a constant flow of people coming through the agency that I had to deal with. So I also got a lot of experience there dealing with some of the top people in the country, and began to see they were just like other people. And so that made it easy for me in the future to deal with boards and directors and so forth.
Now, these veterans of World War II really had a different kind of reception generally in the community,
Yes,
didn't
they
they?
had extreme favor. It was extremely favorable for them. And I started out, we were supposed to be doing public relations, didn't know anything about it, but I simply went to the newspapers and talked to the reporters, and I asked them, how do you do this? If I had a particular idea or story, I'd just go and ask them, and they were extremely helpful, really terrific. And I made a number of friends among all of that group, too. Still train many friends. Lee Goodman, who was one of the key reporters on the old Daily News. What's his name? The medical writer for the Times.
Oh, Harry Nelson.
Harry Nelson, people like that are still, I still have friendships. But they were extremely helpful just by asking.
How long did you stay with that job?
Oh, I was there, I think, for about 2.5 years.
And then where did you go?
Well, I left there and went into business with Ed Flynn, who was a PR man, and I had a business of providing. I had the idea of developing public relations for social agencies, and so I had a few little contracts around with social agencies, principally with the Southern California Society for Mental Hygiene. I wish I could think of the woman who ran that. Your memory seems to be so much better than mine.
I can see her.
She was a very charming
Yes.
person. She was the one that hired me as the Research and Public Relations Director at the Veteran Service Center.
Oh.
And
Levy. Levy.
no,
Not Levy.
no. I should have looked up some of these things.
Well.
At any rate, she hired me on contract to do public relations for the veterans, for the Southern California Society for Mental Hygiene. And then I did a number of things for, helped set up several psychologists and social workers in independent practice, did their PR work for them, that kind of thing. And I was working with Ed Flynn, who had the contract for care for the Western states. So I was working on both ways. And then he had also had other contracts, one with a company that made, at that time, pepper mills. Pepper mills. And salad bowls. So I did, we both did things together. We had an office over at Crossroads of the World. And that's the story of how I started the use of pepper mills in the United States.
I didn't know about that.
No, I did. He and I were working on these things, so I wanted to go to the National Conference of Social Welfare in Cleveland. And so what we decided to do is I worked my way there. And so I went down, and we just gotten this contract with this firm that had these delightful pepper mills. And nobody ever heard of pepper mills at that time. So I went down to the library and I went through and got every recipe I could find that had pepper in it. And I rewrote the recipes and put whole ground pepper in there. And then we went out and got photographs of breakfasts and lunches and dinners and meat and this, always with pepper mills in the pictures. So I had a file about this long with all these stories and all these pictures and samples of pepper mills. I started from here and went to all the major cities. I covered 41 major cities. I worked my way to Cleveland and then all the way to the East Coast and down through the South and back. It was about 6 or 8 weeks totally. But that was how I worked my way to the National Conference of Social Welfare.
And I would go in.
I would go in and put those pepper mills on the desk of the food editor. Say, how do you like those? They didn't know what they were. And then I would work it up, and I got double truck spreads of displays, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and every major newspaper in the country, plus established a liaison with all the food editors in the major cities. And meanwhile, Ed was working on the various associations like the Meat Institute and so forth, and he got these pictures placed in national magazines in cooperation with these groups. That's how we started to use whole ground pepper in this country.
That's very
Didn't know
interesting.
that.
No, I didn't know that. Did your social work experience and education help in that?
Well, it helped with approach because basically I was always constantly dealing with what was the person starting with, where were they. That was a very good lesson. Starting where the other person is is a basic, I think. And so I always found a connection and good reception that way. But then that led me into the Southern California Society for Mental Hygiene, asking me to take over.
Into the what? I didn't hear that.
Into the Southern California Society for Mental Hygiene, because I had that contract, and when her name is right on the tip of my tongue, when she left, they asked me to take over. Prior to that time, what we had done was, and this is another story nobody really knows, only few people know about it. I developed a PR program relative to the mental hospitals because I had worked there and I had seen what had happened. And I developed an expose, and I got all the facts about what was going on in the hospitals, the problem of putting patients in nursing homes and so forth. And we went to, how did he do that? TER, or the fellow who was the editorial writer for the Daily News, and he used to sign his editorials.
Bodie?
No, he was very famous there at the time. Any rate, we went to him and placed a whole series of pieces of information, which he began to write editorials about, and plus I planted several columns on the conditions in state hospitals. That got picked up all up and down the state, and we were front page news for about a month and a half on how bad the conditions were in the state hospitals. And as a result of that, Governor Warren fired the woman who was the head of the Department of Mental Hygiene, a political appointee. And we were able to mobilize a lot of the sentiment, and we forced Warren to, in making the replacement, to make the deans of the medical schools responsible for the replacement. That's how we brought Tallman to California, because he had a big record in Ohio of developing a good mental hospital system. So we forced the selection, got the first psychiatrist as the head of the Department of Mental Hygiene at that point. Is it the first or I think it was this. No, I think it was the second, because there had been Rozanoff. So, and then our agency, along with the Northern California Society, supported Tallman's total restructuring of the state mental hygiene program. And he worked me to death. I was up and down the state all the time. And we conducted campaigns from the outside to push him relative to these programs. And at that time, we, for example, organized a campaign to get a visible piece of meat on the patient's plate. And I was keeping the Southern California Society for Mental Hygiene alive by running these community lectures and forums and so forth, and raising money that way, principally because we got a little pittance from the community chest, but that was all. So I developed the income that way and began to bring really top-notch people. I had known Bill Menninger, so I got him out here. He used to come out every year for us. I would get Chauncey Alexander, all of the big names in psychiatry. We introduced the fellow that was the guru of gerontology, new psychiatrist, people like that. That's the way I kept the agency alive and raising money. Finally took them out of the community chest. And so
was there a disadvantage in their being in the community chest?
Yes, because the community chest had rules as to how you could raise money, which was all of which were difficult. They didn't allow you access to free money, in effect. And first we spent a year or so in going after the community chest to give us an appropriate share, and we did get some increase, but it was small, and it really didn't deal with the total problem that we had of really financing a mental health program. So we developed, during all this time I was going to school, through all of this. As a matter of fact, when I was working as a PR organization, I finally had to come to a decision about whether I was going to stay in social work or go into the PR field regularly, because our commercial accounts were bringing us a lot more money than the social welfare accounts. And at some point I really had a very hard decision to make about that. And I decided that I'd had about 12 years of experience by this time, 10 or 12 years in social work. I decided I just couldn't throw all of that over, and I was dedicated to the kind of work I was doing. So I quit that. That's when I went to work for the Mental Hygiene Society. But it was an important decision point in my life to stay in the field. And so I left, subsequent to that time, I left the Mental Hygiene Society to go back to school, finish up my work. That was in think it was 50. Was it 50? Yeah. I came back for a year to finish up for my master's. Subsequent to that time, then in 54, I came back to work on a doctorate. And that was when I, at that point, I took a job with the Heart Association, working on a research project, which I worked on for 2 years. And
what did that consist of?
Pardon?
What was the research project?
Well, the research project was doing a study of coronary patients in industry. It was Cardiacs in Industry program, it was called. And what we did was convince a number of the major companies in Los Angeles to cooperate with us. And we took patients who had been diagnosed as having cardiac disease and coronary disease, and we put them through a very detailed examination, which involved, at that time, it involved the use of the treadmill, pulmonary tests, and so forth. We had a combination of a social worker, a physician, who was a research physician, and a technician, and then we had a couple of other physicians assigned. And I did detailed life histories on these people, including a 15-minute section, every 15 minutes of their life for a period of a week or a month, to see what kind of energy expenditure they had. And we built the whole thing around the concept of the degree of energy requirement. As we did eventually, after I left, that Lee Horowitz came in and did it. I hired him as a second person, but we did about over 1,000 patients out of all these industries.
Now, were you already the director of the?
No, I was just
came later.
Oh, that was one of my jobs while I was going to school. I had 3 jobs at the time. So we made some very important discoveries. We discovered that 25% of the patients who were diagnosed as coronary disease by the best people in town did not have coronary disease. And it was principally because there were not precise examinations of the nature that we were able to give. So, and that's when the use of the treadmill in what we call stress testing. We actually put people under stress, had them function. We were monitoring their hearts at the time, as well as dealing with some of the social and family issues and things of that sort. And we discovered that about 85% of the people that had coronary disease.
This interview continues on side B. Chauncey Alexander continues on side B from side A on this first cassette.
Okay, we were talking about the Cardiacs in Industry project.
Yes.
And that project, we were able to demonstrate that 85% of the patients who had coronary disease and were working in industry could go back to work at work greater than they had done before. very important fact. And that was a demonstration to the industries themselves that they could, in effect, rehabilitate and save very important employees that they had, you see. And so I worked with all the major industries here, Union Oil and Lockheed and all the big ones, because we started with them. And we had to overcome a number of problems to do that. But then we also did these energy measurements, and we were able to demonstrate such things, for example, as the fact that clerks in the normal office do more work than do the people on a production line. They actually expend more energy.
That's surprising, isn't it?
Yes, and it comes from a very simple fact that clerks in an office are constantly getting up from desks, bending over, getting into files, and so forth, often carrying things. And whereas on production lines, most people are standing, working, and not moving their body through space very much.
That's really a fascinating finding, because we think of sedentary workers as so we think of sedentary workers as not having the kind of stress.
But you see, what we were doing, we're measuring energy requirements. And if you think about it, it's very simple. When you get up from a desk, you raise your weight through approximately 2 to 3 feet. That's an expenditure of energy, whereas it's much greater than anything you're doing on a parallel plane. In other words, walking, anything. You're using much more energy to push that weight through space. And so people who work on production line generally have very low level of energy expenditure. For example, women, housewives at home, expend probably 4 or 5 times more energy than does their husband who works on a production line. Making a bed, for example, you have to, bend, lift, move over, stretch, those kinds of things. And we were measuring those. We actually put equipment on people, and we used a technique that for the first time of a radio telemetry, where we would have this equipment, put it on somebody, they'd be on a production line, and then we'd be somewhere off in a distance measuring that via radio telemetry, so we wouldn't interfere with the work process, things like that. It was a very fascinating project, and we published a number of things on that, and it was the start. As a result of that, we started a campaign in the Heart Association to get physicians to use treadmills in their office. We discovered that people had silent heart attacks, for example. We had people have heart attacks while they were on the treadmill and had no pain. Some people don't have a pain mechanism. There's all kinds of interesting things that grew out of that project.
Now, were there physicians on the board of the agency?
Oh, yes, it was dominated by physicians.
And
that's a whole other story.
How did? Well, I think we should hear how you worked with the members of the board, and were they advocates of these findings and doing something about them?
Oh, yes.
Or were they?
Well, they did eventually after it was all explained to them, and after we overcame.
They didn't accept it immediately.
No. We had to overcome. We had a special problem there with Dr. Bullock.
Well, everybody had a special problem with Dr. Bullock.
Well, I was called, director of this research project, and we had an executive who also was a chronic alcoholic. And the agency was going downhill very fast. And they had an election, and they had they elected Alex. They elected a doctor who was a businessman at the same time. But they had a chairman of the board, Robertson, who was an attorney, who was his father had been for 25 years the head of Westinghouse, and he was interested in business mostly. And they called me in and asked me to take over the directorship of the agency because they'd seen what I had done with this research project and so forth. And I said that they had just terminated this fellow after a big fight. And I said I couldn't go in there under the conditions that were there because of the they were still fighting over what they were going to do with him and so forth and so on. So I continued on a research project for about 6 months, and they came to me again and said, we really need you to go in and reorganize this agency, and we'll support you, but you've got, as you know, there are a lot of problems there. The agency was principally controlled by Dr. Bullock, and Dr. Bullock had controlled it by virtue of controlling the research committee, and he controlled the expenditure of the major sector of the funds that the Heart Association raised, and he was kind of the czar of research in cardiology in Los Angeles because of this control of funds. And he was a very typical czar, too, as you know.
Who didn't know much about research. Who didn't know much about research.
Well, he thought he did, but he would, his main thing was power, and it was controlling these guys and he'd do favors to those that kowtowed to him. And so there had been 2 or 3 years before a big battle in which George Griffith, you remember George?
Yes.
Tried to come in and really move Bullock out, and Bullock gave him a terrible whipping. The board was dominated by physicians. There were about 60 or 65% physicians on the board, and they all principally went along with this because of the money that was going into research. He had done a very clever thing. He got the board to pass a policy that 50% of the funds that were taken in would go to research, and the program was research, education, and community service. But those got virtually nothing. And he would, after the campaign was over, even before, he would demand 50% of the gross. Well, after you took out the administrative costs, after you took out the fundraising costs, 50% of the gross meant that you had to go in debt. This agency was in debt about $400,000 at the time. They were bankrupt. They weren't able to pay their
considering the value of $1 at that time.
Right. That's a lot of money.
That's a tremendous sum.
But they had gone into debt, and the executive was really incompetent and incapable of dealing it, and he only stayed in there because he kowtowed to this little group of Bullock and a couple of others that controlled the agency. So I was brought in to break that whole thing up. And it took me about 4 years to do that, 3 or 4 years. Bullock had all the records in his office, in his personal office. There were all kinds of things like that. well, I went in and I had to go to the bank and borrow money to keep the agency alive for about three months until we got through the campaign. Then I had to develop the policy, reconsideration of this policy, and interpret to the board what was happening fiscally to the agencies. And that was a consistent month after month after month fight. I was working 14, 16 hours a day. First I had to spend about 6 weeks going through the books to figure out what was wrong with everything, you see. And they didn't have good records. And then as we moved along, I began to move in to get a more balanced program. I developed the concept of a balanced program. That meant that education and community service had to be brought up front. And I found some physicians, principally Dick Call, Dr. Call, who was medical director for Union Oil, and got him on the board. And he was a strong advocate for community service programs because he had experienced this research project, you see, and they were concerned about providing community services to employees. So that kind of a force had to be developed within the agency, and we initiated that by proposing research projects which were socially oriented research. And we picked out the first one, which was the iatrogenic effect on children in cardiac surgery, and developed projects which were research oriented but built around rehabilitation purposes. And that served as an initiation, a counter of what was totally the kind of applicable research. Then we initiated some educational programs. We expanded the board from what was 25 members to 125.
How could you use 125?
Well, we brought in a lot of...
was this to crowd out
this was to...
Louis Bullock?
Well, it was to overcome the dominance of Bullock and a small group of physicians, and built around the concept of developing a community board. And so we had representation.
This was a county-wide agency.
Yes.
So that you needed more than the city of Los Angeles.
Exactly. And we also had to develop local offices. We first started that by initiating local offices during the campaign for campaign purposes. Then from there we built those into service offices for people in local communities, you see, and eventually had a staff of, we had about 11 or 12 offices around the county with a professional staff running these offices eventually. But we had to overcome this total dominance and focus on the narrow kind of research. Even the research itself was fairly narrow, and we were able to introduce and weaken Bullock's control by introducing other kinds of research, broader research, basic research, for example. And we initiated the idea of basic cardiovascular laboratories with lifetime appointments for the directors. And we brought Momartz to head that, famous Belgian scientist to head that. And the fellow who had been the research scientist in our project on coronary disease, Sid Sobin, also supported a laboratory for him at USC. And things like that were introduced to gradually weaken. Finally, it took a courageous physician to come in and wipe out Bullock's control. And Bullock had been the chair of this research committee for aeons. And Dr. Covell, who eventually became one of the closest friend and is my physician now, came in, and I discovered him when I went to the first research committee and sat next to him, and I noticed that he was predicting who would get research and who wouldn't. And I got interested in it, and he had a handle on exactly what had been going on and what Bullock was doing and so forth. And so he would sit there in these meetings, and they'd have these research projects come up, and Bullock had a terrible practice. He'd make these guys come in and plead for money, in effect. And he was very domineering and controlling. But when I saw how sharp Mickey Covell was, I immediately tried to move him into broader leadership. And he eventually became president of the association. When he became president, he appointed a new research committee chairman, and that was like turning the agency upside down. That was about 5 years after I'd been there. We were able to accomplish that. And then we were able to move on from there to a much more balanced program.
Did Bullock ever leave that board?
Yes, he did. And he went to American Cancer Society and gave them fits.
I remember because I was doing some research projects for them and also on their state board.
Well, I had dealt with Bullock before, you see, and because I was on the health and welfare committees of Community Chest all the way back, and Bullock was on there, and we were constantly at loggerheads on that way in which he dealt with positions he took on various programs and agencies, and represented the most reactionary kind of approach. So he tried to keep me from being the executive director, and he later attacked me several times politically, trying to get me out of there. But I survived, got through it all. And so we developed the agency. There were lots of fascinating policy problems there. We eventually changed the American Heart Association because of the policies they had, which were very limited. I made the agency the largest heart association in the country, with the best program and raised the most money. And but we didn't have any representation in the American Heart Association, and we had to give a very sizable chunk of our money to them.
To the national.
And and to the state. And we were represented through the state. We constituted approximately 80% of the state's income, and we had no direct representation. And
how did you deal with that?
well, we started out trying to get recognition or changes in policy based upon the American Heart Association had developed, and as a result of it was the outcome of local development. They formed the American Heart Association instead of the American Heart Association forming locals, you see. So they eventually went into a program where they had state chapters, but New York and Chicago were exceptions. They were direct affiliates. And so we applied for direct affiliate status, and they had a policy against any other affiliates. So they whipped us a couple of times on that because we were going through the California Association, the representation was there, you see, and the control was there. And that was controlled principally by the San Francisco. So we initiated a program to evaluate the structure and organization of the American Heart Association. And Dick Dotz, who was the president of the Pacific Mutual Insurance Company, took the leadership of that and was a very good, sharp guy who was very sound organization. And I did an analysis of all these relationships, the money relationships and the program relationships and so forth. And we were able to, in a delegate assembly, force the American Heart Association to set up a committee to deal with that. And as a result of that committee work, we got the thing changed so that Los Angeles became a direct affiliate of the American Heart Association. And now has a great deal of power in the organizational structure. That was another very interesting.
Well, it sounds like a very exciting period of.
Oh, it was. Well, the whole thing was a period of growth. Bringing in other professions, for example, social work and nursing particularly. We gradually began to move in by developing a professional education committee where we began to hold. See, the doctors had always had these annual forums, and we turned those into money makers too by the registration and so forth. And so I was able to show the board that, well, this is a good idea. It's making money. Let's do this for other professions, you see. And nurses need to know more about heart disease. Social workers need to know more about heart disease. So we were able to set up another professional education committee. We got strong people from the nursing and social groups. And we started with annual forum for nurses, annual forum for social workers, and then moved from there into a combination, opposed to cancer and TB, that we combine our efforts. And so we did joint programs for years. And they still, I think they're still hold those programs of bringing three agencies cooperating in professional education. But beyond that, we were then able to move from there into the other professions proposing research projects, you say, which penetrated this research dominance. And so we get one in there, and that would begin to lay the groundwork for others. And we kept taking these kinds of reports, so this is what happened, and this was the benefit to the board. And so we gradually, and the physicians themselves began to see the agency in a different fashion. They began to see the significance of the social aspects of heart disease. Things like a kitchen. They had originally set up a kitchen that was designed by an architect for people who had heart disease. I picked that up and we promoted that, and we ran training classes for cardiac patients. Well, doctors began to see that their patients benefited from this kind of activity, you see. So we broadened their outlook that way, and they began supporting those kinds of efforts. But in each case, it took a period of time, a year or two, to educate them enough to educate enough of the doctors active in the association to have them start making demands on the agency for these kinds of things. We had another big run-in with Bullock when several of our doctors went to John Hopkins and heard the first idea about cardiac resuscitation by pushing on a chest compression. We were running a training program here for doctors on how to slash open the chest and reach in and squeeze the heart at that time. And a couple of our physicians, Dr. Finefield and others, went back, saw this, were very excited. I came back. So we developed a program of, first, we introduced it in the community, and there was mixed reviews on it. But we continued with it, and we began to train physicians in this technique. We set up training programs in the technique, brought the original research people out here, and went after the program. And then from there, we expanded it to life-saving personnel, like firemen and policemen and so forth. And we started in an interesting place. We started in the movie industry with that because they were very concerned about their stars, and they wanted to guarantee, this was a kind of a guarantee. So we started training movie industry firemen and policemen as the start. Well, we got terrific opposition from the Medical Association, for teaching the public or teaching other people than doctors in this technique. And as a consequence, Bullock was the president of the Medical Association at that time. So he opposed it, and he called up. We were asked to come on television with this thing. He called up all the doctors on this committee. There were 18 of them, and threatened them that if they went on television, they would be hauled up before the Medical Association, for unethical practice, and 14 other things. So we got the doctors together, and 17 of them hung tight with us, and we went ahead with it and developed from there. We then started training all the firemen throughout the county, and then training nurses, and the thing just continued to expand from there on, and it became a common public technique. We brought out those plastic people, to test on and so forth, that kind of thing. But it was a battle all along the way against the status quo kind of concept. Only the doctors could do these techniques. That was
So you really had a double target to re-educate the doctors and also reach the community people.
And to develop counter forces, develop the counter forces in these policy considerations. We brought minorities onto the board, and that was
unusual at that time, wasn't it?
Yes, and there was a big battle about that,
among board members.
Yeah, the board members were resisting, particularly the small group that tended to try to control the association, because in effect this was diluting their authority and power, and so we were able to argue that as we developed these regional offices, we went into Watts and other places, and we were able to argue that these people were helping us in the campaign and so forth. They deserved a voice in the agency. And that was the way we were able to bring them in, using the power of money, which was that well, you want to raise this money, don't you? Well, we better have all the people that can help us in here.
Pretty sneaky.
That was the way you had to do it. And that, as a result, we began to get local organization focused around these local offices that we had. And there's where I learned another lesson. Was I started out and hired social workers in all those offices. And I felt, we've got to have professional people in there. They have to answer a lot of questions. They have to know community resources and so forth. But they also had to be organizers. They had to see what was consideration in their community area. How could they advance the education program and so forth. And they also had to be part of fundraising campaigns. I found that, we had failures. I began to find that it was a question of a kind of attitude, mentality, and ability to organize. Mm-hmm. That if the person could organize, if they run into a problem and began to separate it into its component parts or into steps to deal with it, if they had that kind of mentality or approach, they made good directors of these community offices. So I had some good social workers in there who were successful, but some of them I had to get rid of. And eventually I had a mix of people who were, some of whom were in education, some of whom were in one or two psychologists. But I began to see that the basic requirement was the ability to organize and have a professional approach to it, you see. And that taught me a lesson of, looking for something other than just a degree in what you're getting in people. And I tried every way possible to find, I was so dedicated to social work that I was trying every way possible to find social workers who would do this. But it began to settle down to the fact of what was a basic requirement of the job that had to be matched by the qualities or abilities of the person. So that was an important kind of lesson to me.
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, then I went from there to the UCLA.
How long had you stayed there?
13 years. And it was all coming around again and again. I could have retired there at a good salary, and just stayed on as an executive for all those, until I retired, because we were successful. But it was all coming up around and around, and the same things were coming up again.
You needed change.
Right. So Nikki Covell, who I'd worked with as president, came to me to take a job to run the regional medical programs for UCLA. We were in charge. We had a fellow named Dr. Brayton, who was a surgeon, but was really interested more in professional education than anything. And he needed help in how to organize this program, which was under the responsibility of all the medical schools. Each of the medical schools had a territory, and we had 9 counties. So I was brought in as the associate director with Dr. Covell and Dr. Breen. So we organized a program. That was the best job I ever had. It was a marvelous combination of organizing in the community and teaching. And I was teaching in the School of Public Health and at the social work, teaching community organization. And so I had that, working with the students and the stimulation that comes in having to investigate research and everything, know what you're talking about in class. And plus the fact that we were organizing, starting with doctors and organizing community committees in each of these counties to plan health services. It was a marvelous program. And we had federal money. And so we organized these groups, and we broke into the medical profession by hiring doctors who were mostly retired or near the time, and they wanted something to do that was broader in outlook than what they'd been doing. So I had to train these guys to be community organizers, and I backed them up with social workers and Al Toribio and Lee Horowitz, and we got the whole crew in there, and we developed some marvelous programs in that. Organized community clinics. We had to break through a lot of we were dealing with the conservative counties, the Central Valley counties, too. So we had to break through the resistance of all the medical profession on doing anything about planning in the community. And so we had to get them involved with citizens, other citizens, and then deal with the planning, get them to learn that they weren't the only people who knew what was needed in the community.
Was this under the School of Public Health primarily?
No, it was a medical school.
It was a medical school.
Was we worked directly for Rappaport, the dean there. And a funny incident about that, too. We were organizing in Watts, and we were organizing to form a new school of medicine there. And we were working with that committee of physicians. It's named after the black doctor who Drew, right? So we, Al Toribio and I were mostly handling that, and so we had a local committee down in Watts, and so we were trying to get the dean to understand what this is all about, and he was very ivory tower, and he was just interested in research and mostly his little world. He'd never dealt with the community at all. So we took him down to a meeting of our committee one night, and he gets into this committee, and he gives them a little talk about how important what they're doing and the UCLA Medical School behind you and so forth and so on. Then the people in there unloaded on him on what they weren't doing and how they needed this and how they needed this kind of help, and all the problems of that community were just paramount. He had never experienced anything like that before. He was, and he's used to being treated like royalty, and these people were chewing him to pieces. And he never had an experience like that. He was blanched in dealing with it. And so Al and I kind of stepped in, and we kind of smoothed the thing out and dealt with it, and after we got out of there next day, he had us over to office. He says, I didn't know we were dealing with this kind of thing, He was scared to death. And it was the experience about every time I'd see him, he would remark something about this visit that he had run into. But it was really, really funny to see him exposed, to the community kind of sentiment and feelings.
It's especially interesting because he was one of the several deans of medical schools who was supposed to be setting up that hospital, and the members of his own faculty had been the primary ones to make this recommendation to the McCone Commission to study the Watts riots, but he had never really felt a part of it.
He'd never understood
That's
it.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Don Brayton was the one who carried the lead on that and was strong for it, and because he was having to mobilize the medical community to support this thing, as well as deal with some of the problems of black doctors. You know, there were all kinds of power struggles and things like that in forming it. So it was Don was very happy that we had given Rappaport this education.
But it suggests the importance of really having a personal exposure to the area of problem and the people involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. Well, it was. I loved that job. It was so much fun because it was this combination of teaching and the other. And so
Why did you leave it?
I got offered the NASW job. That was in 68, 69. And Whitney Young came to me and asked me to apply for that. Gip Trailer, remember Gip?
Oh, sure.
Gip is living in Arizona. I see him occasionally. And Gip was on the committee and was pushing for somebody who could come in and reorganize the NASW.
Didn't you have something between UCLA and you went directly from there
Went
to
directly
the
from UCLA to
National
NASW.
Association of Social Workers?
December 1, 1969, Sally and I landed in New York. And
Well, maybe this is the point at which we should stop and then pick up again if you have the patience and can work out
that's
the
kind
time.
of fun reminiscing about these things.
No, I think it's very useful because I think anyone who is researching the areas of what a social worker does, what kinds of conditions are there in a community that make it possible or impossible to do things. I think these are wonderful examples.
Well, we've, in a sense, I feel like we've skimmed the surface, kind of a resume review, because in each one of these areas there are very specific problems, that I had to deal with, in which there were questions of strategy, of ethics, of things like that, and I was at the same time going to school. So that helped me a good deal because I could project a lot of what I was running into school, get help from the faculty in classes, things of that sort. I did papers that were related to what I was doing, so there was a good combination there.
Well, that sounds like it was a real benefit.
Yeah.
Hard, but a benefit.
Yes, and the fact of each one of these problems involved the whole question of analysis of the situation, determining some kind of a plan or approach to it, how to deal with the thing, and then execution, the whole business, so that it's stuff I teach now.
I think this is extremely valuable. This interview continues on cassette number 2, side A. This is cassette number 2, an interview with Chauncey Alexander in the office of Francis Feldman. This is November 15th, 1991. There has been a pause since the first part of this interview, which occurred 9/27/90. The delay was because of Mr. Alexander's illness and surgery. Check it.
Because I'm not always sure, with my deafness.
Yes, well, I share that problem. So why don't you talk into the machine and we'll just test this.
All right. Well, maybe perhaps if I start talking, I can give you a fast rundown on the
And let's start. We'll test this.
I don't hear anything in this room that might counter what we're going to talk about.
I don't think so, because it's been used for recording.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's run that back and see.
All right, you want me to start right from the beginning?
Yes, why not?
Okay, I was born May 11, 1916.
All right, that's a very good beginning.
In Kansas City, Missouri, to a middle-class family. My father was a bank examiner for the early years of my life, and then became a car salesman, and was very successful. Made quite a bit of money, and we came to California as a result of that in 1927, and landed in Glendale, and I started through the Glendale schools at the 6th grade. And those early days were in a conservative community. My father was something of an inventor, and he manufactured operating lamps and infrared ray lamps, and had them in most of the state hospitals around California at the time. And then the Depression hit, and we ate most of the machinery out of the manufacturing shop to stay alive. He gradually sold off all this equipment and so forth. And the folks went on welfare at the time, and my mother tried to keep it away from us as children.
In good middle class style.
Yeah, feeling that it was really a very bad thing to do. And the major part of what I remember is the poverty that we had, although we had a place to live. But I remember I had one pair of pants for the entire year, and I pressed those pants every night in order to appear decent. Finally, as a result, my mother and father were both active in the Democratic Party. And finally, as a result of their activity, my father got a job in the post office. And he spent the next 35 years in the post office. And my mother continued to be active in the Democratic Party, and was also a professional volunteer. She was head of the March of Dimes in Glendale for 20 years. She was on the Salvation Army board for at least that long. Red Cross, anything in the community. But she was sort of this was in a Republican community, and so she was sort of the accepted Democrat in the community because of her work. And at an early age, I remember at 10 or 11, I was stuffing literature. That was one of my first disappointments, too, because I worked all summer stuffing literature for the Democratic candidate for governor, and was supposed to get paid some kind of a meager wage, and I never got paid. And
Why was that? They didn't have the money, or didn't think it was worth paying youngsters?
Well, I don't know why. I think they just ran out of money and didn't pay it. But that was a big disappointment in my life, and it led me not to trust politicians very much. So, and that was, but it was also narrow community. It was a white, generally upper middle class community, and I was more lower middle class because of our poverty, although it was, Glendale was a wealthy community, and so kids that I went to school with, there was always a dual group of children or of kids that were either poor or you're wealthy. And as a matter of fact, later I ran in two different gangs, one of the upper class gang and also the lower class gang at the same time. But it was also a background of prejudice, because I didn't realize it at the time, but although I was conflicted about it because of my strong religious upbringing. I was brought up in the Methodist Church. I had 10 years of perfect record of attendance at the Wednesday night classes for youth and the Sunday sessions, and I think that that whole religious ethical base was very strong in me. I left the church about 13 or 14 years old because what I thought was the hypocrisy of the people that were of the church, and the fact that I'd see people in their daily life doing things that I didn't think were proper. And it was finally consummated by a open trial of one of the people who was the elders in the church, who was a grocery clerk in the community there, because of his relationship with a woman, and they had an open trial about it. And I knew that other men in the community had been consorting with the same woman, and but they made a big thing about this fellow, and I felt that was hypocritical. And that, along with the questions that I was raising about, particularly as I learned more about science in school. I was from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was going to be a doctor because my grandfather was a country physician, and I was headed that way. So I studied medicine all my life. From the time I was about 5 or 6. Thesis, I was going to be a doctor. But there were, I remember, 2 Jewish boys in our entire school, and there were no blacks, and blacks were not allowed to stay overnight in Glendale. And I had all the prejudices of middle western southern-based family, because my family came from Virginia originally, and my great-grandfather was killed by a runaway slave, and that was all the history in the family, that kind of thing. But I was always contradicted in the feeling that existed because of the religious background. You're supposed to accept everybody as they are, be kind to everyone, and although I had those prejudices, I was constantly questioning myself and people around me who would be making remarks about blacks or about Jews or whatever. And so there was a constant problem of contradiction I felt. So I felt I was constantly trying to find out or learn what was going on. At any rate, after high school, or as I finished high school, I worked the last 2 years of high school at nights and on Saturdays in machine shops because my folks didn't have any money or anything. So, and I then was looking for a job, wanted a job, and another pal of mine and I shipped out summer of '34, and we were on a freighter that went to San Francisco, got stopped in San Francisco because of the '34 strike. We, after about 11 days, we got off of that freighter because all of the men who were really strike breakers felt that they weren't getting anywhere, and they heard about the ability to work for much higher wages on the docks. So I went along with them and worked on the docks all summer during that strike. And so I was among a combination of everything from professionals who were out of work, businessmen and farmers and so forth, to the worst riffraff, convicts and professional strike breakers.
How old were you then?
I was about 17.
Very impressionable.
Yeah. So I learned a good deal in that time, and working on the docks, loading and unloading boats and so forth. And we finally, as the strike wound down, we escaped because we had to get through the picket lines and so forth. And, we were followed by the strikers and went in and out of San Francisco and finally avoided them. Came back. So when I came back, that seemed like a radical change in my life. So then I started went 2 years to Glendale Community College, Glendale Junior College it was at that time. And I was fortunate. First I had a short-time job under the student aid program at the time. And then I got a job through my father and a friend at working nights at Filtro Corporation in Downey, and shoveling clay. So I shoveled 10 tons of clay every night, and then went to school in the daytime. And then the last 2 years I went to UCLA, and so I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and make a 7 o'clock class at UCLA, leave UCLA at 3 o'clock, and get to Downey, work till midnight, and then come back, and I did that.
I hope you had a car.
Yes. Well, by that time I had a car. And I worked for 4.5 years, nights, that way. And there were a lot of learning experiences there, and working with in that plant was very difficult work. But hard physical labor, particularly for the first 2 or 3 years. And then I got to run machinery and repair things. I gradually became kind of a repairman around there. And when I graduated, I want to tell you this story particularly because you would get a big kick out of it. When I graduated at UCLA, I wanted to, get a good job. And out of this laboring class, and I'd worked all my life in jeans, and I worked my way out of them, and you could never get me back into them again. This popular business about jeans doesn't affect me at all. But I went to, my sociology professor recommended that I go to their state relief administration because they were hiring social workers. Mm-hmm. And I
And
went
you
to,
were qualified. You had a degree.
I had a not a master's degree, but a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so I went down and I applied, and I was interviewed by a very nice woman who interviewed me for a while, and then she told me I wasn't qualified, that she didn't feel that I was qualified because I'd been mostly working in factories and so forth, and the fact that I had a degree didn't make a difference. So I went home and I was very depressed about that. My mother asked me what's wrong, and I told her, and she says, well, let me see about that. The following day, she called up Supervisor Knudsen, and she told him that I was looking for a job and she wanted his help. So she sent me down to see him, and I went in to see him, and he says, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I was kind of interested in this social work job. I don't know anything about that, but it sounds like something I'd like to do. It's working with people and so forth. And he picks up the telephone, calls, says, now you go over to this office. It was the same office I'd been at for.
Same woman?
Same woman. And I think it was Blythe Francis who worked there at the time.
She was in family service.
And at any rate, when I came in, the same woman welcomed me with open arms and about how great it was that she was going to have me on, to be able to put me to work. That was an important lesson, too.
What district were you in?
Well, I started in Pasadena,
In
Family
Pasadena.
District. I was just there for about 2 or 3 months, and I was transferred to Metropolitan District. And down at Siberia it was called.
Yeah, very different kind of
Very,
caseload.
very tough. And it was a marvelous work experience. I loved it. And because I was, we had, working in an old warehouse, we had about 1,000 men coming in there every day. And there were 3 of us who, first I was working interviewing, and they gradually, pretty soon they put me up front. And I and 2 other men were the first contacts that people had coming in, and we'd get them to the right place real fast. And so it was, I loved it because it was hard and fast, and you had to fight with the with the accountants about getting somebody shoes and so forth. And we'd have 4 or 5 epileptic seizures a day, and it was just one fascinating thing after another. And I was imbued with this idea of studying human beings and working with them and developing relationships. And I had 2 very good supervisors, 2 women supervisors who were very strong social workers.
Do you remember who they were?
Well, I would remember.
That doesn't really.
Yeah, one was a big, heavy-set woman who was just terrific. She worked for, she had worked for Travelers Aid for many years. You may remember her.
Was that Anita Tidball?
No. It was, gosh, I hadn't thought about that for years.
Well,
At any rate, I don't know how much of this stuff.
I
I don't know how much of this stuff you want. I don't know how much of this you want to know about. At any rate, that was a great experience, and I was then introduced to the union at that time, the whole concept of unions, and I remember another telling incident was I was invited to go to lunch by Ed Bach. Do you remember him by any chance?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Ed Bach. And he, And he took me to lunch, and he started telling me about the union and about the fact that our conditions were so poor, and we were sitting on boxes half the time, and the conditions were terrible, and that we ought to all get together. And the whole idea of people getting together and helping themselves was very appealing to my religious background, I think. At any rate, I listened to him, and I said, that sounds like a very good idea. I can remember myself saying that. I'd never even thought of or heard of unions before, coming out of the background I had. And Glendale was an anti-union town to the hilt. As a matter of fact, I think I must have had a negative reaction. But at any rate, I said, but I'll have to think about it. So another week, we go out again. And I said, well, I've thought about that, and it sounds like a very good idea for people to get together and do something about their own conditions. And but I couldn't join an organization without participating in it. How do I do this? Well, from then on, I was on the committee galore.
What year was this?
That would have been
38,
39. And I was started on several committees, and then Ed took me under his wing, and he was the chair of the grievance committee for the county, the union for the entire county. So he would take me to these meetings and show me what they did and so forth. And after he left, I inherited the committee as the chair, with very little background or knowledge about what I was doing other than what I had learned in just watching Ed work. And that brought me into the centerfold of the union activity at the time. And so I was very much involved in the union work, union development, meetings galore, all that goes with it as part of it. And then we were engaged in that battle to keep the politicians out of the State Relief Administration, and it was a very strong movement to retain professional workers. Meanwhile, my supervisors had moved me to go to school, so I had immediately registered at USC and was taking classes there, some of them downtown and some out here, and one class at a time. And so I was getting a lot of ideas about developing professional outlook on things and knowledge about what I was doing. And I was active there, and I remember that when they started putting politicians into leadership of the offices, and Harry White was my district supervisor. And Harry was an awfully nice chap, but very moderate and conservative, I think, at least as I remember. But he was very fair and objective. And at any rate, we had this red-headed woman that came in there, big, tall, raw-boned woman who, it was said that her former occupation was as a madam for the prostitutes up on Bunker Hill. But by the way, that whole area was my beat, and I finally got so that I was the troubleshooter for that office. If they had a problem of guys locking themselves in their rooms, or I'd have to go out and clean it up, because I was considered to be the one that knew something about psychology, you see. And I was sitting one of the three, and I was sitting the first one in the front, and this woman used to come racing out of her office. She'd have the Workers' Alliance that would come in with meetings, for her, and she'd come racing out of her room. She'd grab the first person she saw to get an answer to some of the problems because she didn't know anything. And I was usually the person. So at one time I remember they had a big delegation and they were all fighting mad. And she raced out there and she grabbed me and literally practically dragged me into her office. And Harry was there too. And so I listened to what they had to say, and then I went down what the policy was, the rules and so forth like that. And they raised some questions, and they had a legitimate grievance. And so I said, well, according to policy, you can get this and this and this, and we'll just take care of that. And so they left, and everything was fine. And as he walked out of the office after they had left, Harry said, Chauncey really handled that very well, didn't he? And she said, well, he ought to. He's one of them. I thought that was quite a compliment.
Yes.
Well, then they were racing through, you remember they were racing through the State Relief Administration, attacking people politically.
Yes.
And then they started firing or terminating the union leaders. And they terminated me once or twice, and they couldn't because I had the highest rating. I had a 98% rating for work. And according to the policy, they couldn't terminate me because of my union activity, but because I had such a high rating. And finally, we had one period where we were picketing the administrator, I remember, and also we were picketing had something to do with Polson. I know because I remember that we had the slogan, "Polecat Polson."
Yes, he was the mayor then.
Yeah, no, he was mayor much later.
Oh, was that right?
Yeah, he was an assemblyman.
Is it the same Polson?
Yeah, he was an assemblyman, and he was heading some kind of a committee investigating the state relief administration.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, and as a result of that, he and or somebody else who was the administrator refused to meet with the union and refused to meet with the picketers and so forth. And so whoever was the leadership, I don't remember, and I was just kind of a follower at that point, we went up to the office and requested to meet with him. And he refused to meet, so everybody just walked into his office. Then they had a big thing there, talk, and they finally got an agreement to meet with the union. At any rate, they took pictures of everybody that was doing this. The press was there, and it was a big thing. Finally, they terminated me.
Go ahead.
And as a result of the termination, I filed an appeal. And because I had the highest rating of anybody in the state Relief Administration, and performance rating, and so I filed an appeal. I went down to the hearing, and the hearing had nothing to do with the performance at all. I was attacked there were other people up there who had done some of the similar thing, who had filed because of performance ratings. But we were attacked by this guy that was the staff man for the Tenney Committee, or the Polson Committee, whichever one it was. We were just attacked by him from this platform. Weren't allowed to make any presentation, so forth. And then when that was over...
Polson was a municipal judge. at that time.
He was?
And chairing these various activities.
Oh.
Yes.
That must have
And I begin to remember now, and because of his role as a judge, he was thought to be an impartial person.
Yeah. At any rate, that whole business was very unsatisfactory because I didn't say anything. I didn't say the fellow just attacked me and said you know that you were you went into this office and so forth without permission and active in union leadership and so forth. It was a direct attack on the union. And so I left there, and subsequently I got a letter in which I was terminated for acts inimical to the public service. Well,
Have you got it framed?
Yeah, I was very fearful about that because I didn't know whether I'd get a job or anything. But later, when I had worked for the state again, the State Department of Hygiene, it never was a problem. Subsequently, it was so illegal and everything that was after they got over that through that period. The whole thing was kind of dismissed, I think. But that was an exciting period, and one where I, from the standpoint of social work, it was a very interesting period because on the one hand I was very active in union, on the other hand I was going to school, and I immediately joined the Professional Association, American Association of Social Workers, and also the American Association of Psychiatric Social Workers. And as a result, I was in the middle of this dialogue about whether unionism was professional or not. And that was a very interesting dialogue, and I had a lot of, I admired people on both sides of those issues. And because they were strong in their points of view, but they had good reasons on both sides. So I was in on a lot of meetings and discussions about those kinds of things at the time. Well, when I left there, I went to, I got a job at Vega Aircraft Corporation in the personnel department because of my psychology background, and worked in the personnel department. And they were, shortly after I was there, they were absorbed by Lockheed. And I went to Lockheed personnel department, and in 1 year we went from 5,000 employees to 80,000 employees and had to process all those. And because, somehow or another, because I had worked in the welfare activity and had a psychology background, they put me in charge of all of the service ends of things. So the health insurance and various things, I was dealing with all those questions, and I would deal with the employees, and what was really kind of an information thing. Employees come in with questions or problems.
So you had early exposure to social policy.
Right, I sure did. Then after that, I left there to take a job. I was very unhappy with that because I saw what was going on. This was at the start of the war, and 41, I think it was. And I saw what was happening. It was such a boondoggle. And I got into the entire plant everywhere. And people, it was a cost-plus operation, and people were just ripping off the government. And the fellow that I worked for, the personnel manager, didn't know 1/10 of what I knew by that time. He had married one of the Lockheed board of directors' daughters, and so he was made the personnel manager. So he would have me doing everything for him, you see. So I was really, got very disgusted with that kind of job and exploitation. And so I had applied, taken civil service exams, and I got, finally, I heard from an appointment in a departmental hygiene as a psychiatric social worker. By that time, I had about a year's schooling, almost a year's schooling. And so I became the chief resident social worker at Patton State Hospital.
This is a continuation of the earlier interviews with Mr. Chauncey Alexander. This one takes place on June 24th, 1993, in the library of the School of Social Work.
Exciting, terrific.
Why don't we start back with your being at the UCLA Medical Center?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Tell me about it.
Well,
What you did there when you were
the,
there.
I left the Heart Association job after 13 years in 1967 and went to the UCLA Medical School for 2 years. And it was at that time that I was recruited by former president of the Heart Association and a couple of people at the medical school. And we were to initiate the regional medical programs. And that was a national program, federally financed through the states, in which there was the medical schools were given the responsibility for the development of new medical programs. So I was brought in as the associate director with Dr. Donald Brayton, who was the director of surgeon there, who'd been very active in professional education. He had done a lot of work in preparing television shows for doctors and how to diagnose patients and do all kinds of things like that. And so I was brought in to organize and plan the whole thing. So it was a wonderful mission, frankly, because it was the job to organize the community, to sponsor through the medical leadership new programs in healthcare. It was one of the Johnson thrusts. So what we did basically is I recruited several social workers to work with me. Al Toribio,
yes.
Remember?
From whom I just had a letter.
And eventually Lee Horowitz. Lee took my place at the Heart Association for about a year or so, and then came over to that program. And what we did essentially was recruit leadership in the medical profession in 9 counties and taught them how to do community organization work. And after I was involved with it and thought about it, it was a very smart operation because we took people who were close to retirement or retired physicians who were fed up with what they were doing, and they were or young, aggressive guys in hospitals. And we had districts in 9 counties. And
we worked with them to organize community advisory committees, very broad-based, representing business leadership, labor, the usual lineup, minorities as civic organizations. And so it was a very, rewarding thing. It was tough moving those doctors from command operation to a persuasion operation. But we had regular training operations, and then what was involved was we'd have to write grant proposals and get them passed for money to support these particular programs. We organized such programs. We organized a major community health clinic in the San Fernando Valley, built around minority leadership in the valley. We organized the Martin Luther King Hospital and medical school operation down there, with using the, what's his name, the black doctor that invented the blood.
Cannon?
No. His name is carried as the Professional Society for Black Doctors down in the Central area. At any rate, we organized local community committees, and then I had an overall committee for the entire region, which I was principally responsible for. But Al and I and Lee and so would go out, and with Dr. Covell and Nikki Covell, we would recruit these people and then put them to work, show them how to set up these committees, show them how to run the committees. And then we developed these various programs. We developed an education program for doctors, nurses, and social workers, in which we could, within 24 hours, put professional information on any problem which they wanted.
I looked at it just at the right moment.
Eyes, because my eyesight was so poor. I don't know why they took me in the first place, but at any rate, I went through that basic training, and then was out and couldn't find a job because I was used by the draft board to fill quotas, and I was drafted 7 times. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to find a job in social work, and I'd worked for a little bit. First, I worked for a few weeks with Family Service Agency, where I'd been doing my field work, and then I'd be drafted. And so that was a period of about 6 months or so, in which I was either being drafted or being released from the Army, because every time I'd go down for an examination, the Army would turn me down because of my eyes. Finally, after the Battle of the Bulge, they started taking everybody in, and so I went in and went to Fort MacArthur. The first day I was there, a psychiatrist saw my background in the hospital and took me to work with him.
Hold on a minute. Okay, we still have a few feet. I don't want to lose that.
And that was Captain Phil Shapiro, who was a marvelous man, psychoanalyst, well-trained. His wife was a psychoanalyst. They were both from San Francisco. And he taught me a tremendous amount during that time. And we worked first for about a year screening people out of the service. Our job was to see the people who...
Before you'd been getting them in.
Yeah. And so our job was to screen them out, and we had a lot of interesting experiences there. Then we were transferred to set up the first psychiatric rehabilitation service and we went to Camp Dworak-Peck, and about 60 miles outside of San Diego, took over a big cavalry camp and set up a complete reconditioning center there. And Phil Shapiro and I were in charge of and Phil was in charge, and I was doing most of the work of organizing this service. We finally wound up with about 15 social workers and half a dozen psychiatrists, several psychologists, and we did.
This is cassette number 2, an interview with Chauncey Alexander in the office of Francis Feldman. This is November 15th, 1991. There has been a pause since the first part of this interview, which occurred 9/27/90. The delay was because of Mr. Alexander's illness and surgery. Check it.
Because I'm not always sure, with my deafness.
Yes, well, I share that problem. So why don't you talk into the machine and we'll just test this.
All right. Well, perhaps if I start talking, I can give you a fast rundown on the book.
Let's start. We'll test this.
I don't hear anything in this room that might counter what we're going to talk about.
I don't think so, because it's been used for recording.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's run that back and see.
All right, you want me to start right from the beginning?
Yes, why not?
Okay, I was born May 11, 1916.
All right, that's a very good beginning.
In Kansas City, Missouri, to a middle-class family. My father was a bank examiner for the early years of my life, and then became a car salesman, and was very successful. Made quite a bit of money, and we came to California as a result of that in 1927, and landed in Glendale, and I started through the Glendale schools at the 6th grade. And those early days were in a conservative community. My father was something of an inventor, and he manufactured operating lamps and infrared ray lamps, and had them in most of the state hospitals around California at the time. And then the Depression hit, and we ate most of the machinery out of the manufacturing shop to stay alive. He gradually sold off all this equipment and so forth. The folks went on welfare at the time, and my mother tried to keep it away from us as children.
In good middle class style.
Yeah, feeling that it was really a very bad thing to do. And the major part of what I remember is the poverty that we had, although we had a place to live. But I remember I had one pair of pants for the entire year, and I pressed those pants every night in order to, appear decent. Finally, as a result, my mother and father were both active in the Democratic Party. And finally, as a result of their activity, my father got a job as in the post office. And he spent the next 35 years in the post office. And my mother continued to be active in the Democratic Party and was also a professional volunteer. She was head of the March of Dimes in Glendale for 20 years. She was on the Salvation Army board for at least that long. Red Cross, anything in the community. But she was sort of this was in a Republican community, and so she was sort of the accepted Democrat in the community because of her work. And at an early age, I remember at 10 or 11, I was stuffing literature. That was one of my first disappointments, too, because I worked all summer stuffing literature for the Democratic candidate for governor, and was supposed to get paid some kind of a meager wage, and I never got paid. And
why was that? They didn't have the money, or didn't think it was worth paying youngsters?
Well, I don't know why. I think they just ran out of money and didn't pay it. But that was a big disappointment in my life, and it led me not to trust politicians very much. So, and that was, but it was also a narrow community. It was a white, generally upper middle class community, and I was more lower middle class because of our poverty, although it was, Glendale was a wealthy community, and so kids that I went to school with, there was always a dual group of children, or of kids that were either poor or you were wealthy. And as a matter of fact, later I ran in two different gangs, one of the upper class gang and also the lower class gang at the same time. But it was also a background of prejudice, because I didn't realize it at the time, but although I was conflicted about it because of my strong religious upbringing. I was brought up in the Methodist Church. I had 10 years of perfect record of attendance at the Wednesday night classes for youth and the Sunday sessions, and I think that that whole religious ethical base was very strong in me. I left the church about 13 or 14 years old because what I thought was the hypocrisy of the people that were of the church, and the fact that I'd see people in their daily life doing things that I didn't think were proper. And it was finally consummated by a open trial of one of the people who was elders in the church, who was a grocery clerk in the community there, because of his relationship with a woman, and they had an open trial about it. And I knew that other men in the community had been consorting with the same woman, and but they made a big thing about this fellow, and I felt that was hypocritical. And that, along with the questions that I was raising about particularly as I learned more about science in the school. From the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was going to be a doctor because my grandfather was a country physician, and I was headed that way. So I studied medicine all my life from the time I was about 5 or 6. Thesis, I was going to be a doctor. But there were, I remember, 2 Jewish boys in our entire school, and there were no blacks, and blacks were not allowed to stay overnight in Glendale. And I had all the prejudices of middle western southern based family, because my family came from Virginia originally, and my great-grandfather was killed by a runaway slave, and that was all the history in the family, that kind of thing. But I was always contradicted in the feeling that existed because of the religious background. You're supposed to accept everybody as they are, be kind to everyone, and although I had those prejudices, I was constantly questioning myself and people around me who would be making remarks about blacks or about Jews or whatever. And so there was a constant problem of contradiction I felt. So I felt I was constantly trying to find out or learn what was going on. At any rate, after high school, or as I finished high school, I worked the last 2 years of high school at nights and on Saturdays in machine shops because my folks didn't have any money or anything. So, and I then was looking for a job, wanted a job, and another pal of mine and I shipped out summer of '34, and we were on a freighter that went to San Francisco, got stopped in San Francisco because of the '34 strike. We, after about 11 days, we got off of that freighter because all of the men who were really strike breakers felt that they weren't getting anywhere, and they heard about the ability to work for much higher wages on the docks. So I went along with them and worked on the docks all summer during that strike. And so I was among a combination of everything from professionals who were out of work, businessmen and farmers and so forth, to the worst riffraff convicts and professional strike breakers.
How old were you then?
I was about 17.
Very impressionable.
Yeah. So I learned a good deal in that time, and working on the docks, loading and unloading boats and so forth. And we finally, as the strike wound down, we escaped because we had to get through the picket lines and so forth. And, we were followed by the strikers and went in and out of San Francisco and finally avoided them. Came back. So when I came back, that seemed like a radical change in my life. So then I went 2 years to Glendale Community College, Glendale Junior College it was at that time. And I was fortunate. First I had a short-time job under the student aid program at the time. And then I got a job through my father and friend at working nights at Filtro Corporation in Downey. and shoveling clay. So I shoveled 10 tons of clay every night, and then went to school in the daytime. And then the last 2 years I went to UCLA. And so I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and make a 7 o'clock class at UCLA, leave UCLA at 3 o'clock, and get to Downey, work till midnight, and then come back, and I did that.
I hope you had a car.
Yes. Well, by that time I had a car. And I worked for 4.5 years, nights, that way. And that was there were a lot of learning experiences there, and working with, in that plant. It was very difficult work. But hard physical labor, particularly for the first 2 or 3 years. And then I got to run machinery and repair things. I gradually became kind of a repairman around there. And when I graduated, I want to tell you this story particularly because you would get a big kick out of it. When I graduated at UCLA, I wanted to, get a good job. And out of this laboring class, and I'd worked all my life in jeans, and I worked my way out of them, and you could never get me back into them again. This popular business about jeans doesn't affect me at all. But I went to, my sociology professor recommended that I go to their state relief administration because they were hiring social workers. And so I went.
You were qualified. You had a degree.
I had a not a master's degree, but a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so I went down and I applied, and I was interviewed by a very nice woman who interviewed me for a while, and then she told me I wasn't qualified. That she didn't feel that I was qualified because I'd been mostly working in factories and so forth, and the fact that I had a degree didn't make a difference. So I went home and I was very depressed about that. My mother asked me what's wrong, and I told her, and she says, well, let me see about that. The following day, she called up Supervisor Knudsen, and she told him that I was looking for a job and she wanted his help. So she sent me down to see him, and I went in to see him, and he says, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I was kind of interested in this social work job. I don't know anything about that, but it sounds like something I'd like to do. It's working with people and so forth. And he picks up the telephone, calls, says, now you go over to this office. It was the same office I'd been at for.
Same woman?
Same woman. And I think it was Blythe Francis who worked there at the time.
She was in family service.
And at any rate, when I came in, the same woman welcomed me with open arms and about how great it was that she was going to have me on, be able to put me to work. That was an important lesson, too.
What district were you in?
Well, I started in Pasadena,
In
family
Pasadena.
district. I was just there for about 2 or 3 months, and I was transferred to Metropolitan District. And down in Siberia, it was called.
Yeah. Very different kind of
Very,
caseload.
very tough. And it was a marvelous work experience. I loved it. And because I was, we had, working in an old warehouse, we had about 1,000 men coming in there every day. And there were 3 of us who, first I was working, interviewing, and they gradually, pretty soon they put me up front. And I and 2 other men were the first contacts that people had coming in, and we'd get them to the right place real fast. And so it was, I loved it because it was hard and fast, and you had to fight with the with the accountants about getting somebody shoes and so forth. And we'd have 4 or 5 epileptic seizures a day, and it was just one fascinating thing after another. And I was imbued with this idea of studying human beings and working with them and developing relationships. And I had 2 very good supervisors, 2 women supervisors who were very strong social workers.
Do you remember who they were?
Well, I would remember.
That doesn't really.
Yeah, one was a big, heavy-set woman who was just terrific. She worked for, she had worked for Travelers Aid for many years. You may remember her.
Was that Anita Tidball?
No. It was, gosh, I hadn't thought about that for years.
Well,
At any rate,
Once
I
in a
don't know how
while,
much of
these
this
people
stuff,
show up
I
in
don't know
other
how much of this
interviews.
stuff you want.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how much of this you want to know about. At any rate, that was a great experience. And I was then introduced to the union at that time, the whole concept of unions. And I remember another telling incident was I was invited to go to lunch by Ed Bach. Do you remember him by any
Yes,
chance?
I do.
Dr. Ed Bach. And he took me to lunch, and he started telling me about the union and about the fact that our conditions were so poor, and we were sitting on boxes half the time, and the conditions were terrible, and that we ought to all get together. And the whole idea of people getting together and helping themselves was very appealing to my religious background, I think. At any rate, I listened to him and I said, that sounds like a very good idea. I can remember myself saying that. I'd never even thought of or heard of unions before, coming out of the background I had. And Glendale was an anti-union town to the hilt. As a matter of fact, I think I must have had a negative reaction. But at any rate, I said, but I'll have to think about it. So another week, we go out again. And I said, well, I've thought about that, and it sounds like a very good idea for people to get together and do something about their own conditions. And but I couldn't join an organization without participating in it. How do I do this? Well, from then on, I was on the committee galore.
What year was this?
That would have been 38,
39.
39. And I was started on several committees, and then Ed took me under his wing, and he was the chair of the grievance committee for the county, the union for the entire county. So he would take me to these meetings and show me what they did and so forth. And after he left, I inherited the committee as the chair, with very little background or knowledge about what I was doing other than what I had learned in just watching Ed work. And that brought me into the centerfold of the union activity at the time. And so I was very much involved in the union work, union development, meetings galore, all that goes with it as part of it. And then we were engaged in that battle to keep the politicians out of the State Relief Administration, and it was a very strong movement to retain professional workers. Meanwhile, my supervisors had moved me to go to school, so I had immediately registered at USC and was taking classes there, some of them downtown and some out here, and one class at a time. And so I was getting a lot of ideas about developing professional outlook on things and knowledge about what I was doing. And I was active there, and I remember that when they started putting politicians into leadership of the offices, and Harry White was my district supervisor. And Harry was an awfully nice chap, but very moderate and conservative, I think, at least as I remember. But he was very fair and objective. And at any rate, we had this red-headed woman that came in there, big, tall, raw-boned woman who, it was said that her former occupation was as a madam for the prostitutes up on Bunker Hill. But by the way, that whole area was my beat, and I finally got so that I was the troubleshooter for that office. If they had a problem of guys locking themselves in their rooms, or I'd have to go out and clean it up, because I was considered to be the one that knew something about psychology, you see. And I was sitting one of the three, and I was sitting the first one in the front, and this woman used to come racing out of her office. She'd have Workers' Alliance that would come in with meetings, for her, and she'd come racing out of her room. She'd grab the first person she saw to get an answer to some of the problems, because she didn't know anything. And I was usually the person. So at one time, I remember they had a big delegation, and they were all fighting mad, and she raced out there, and she grabbed me and literally practically dragged me into her office, and Harry was there too. And so I listened to what they had to say, and then I went down what the policy was, the rules and so forth like that. And they raised some questions, and they had a legitimate grievance. And so I said, well, according to policy, you can get this and this and this, and we'll just take care of that. And so they left, and everything was fine. And as we walked out of the office after they left, Harry said, "Chauncey really handled that very well, didn't he?" And she said, "Well, he ought to. He's one of them." I thought that was quite a compliment.
Yes.
Well, then they were racing through, you remember they were racing through the State Relief Administration, attacking people politically.
Yes.
And then they started firing or terminating the union leaders. And they terminated me once or twice, and they couldn't because I had the highest rating. I had a 98% rating for work. And according to the policy, they couldn't terminate me because of my union activity, but because I had such a high rating. And finally, we had one period where we were picketing the administrator, I remember, and also we were picketing had something to do with Polson. I know, because I remember that we had the slogan of "Polecat Polson."
Yes, he was the mayor then.
Yeah, no, he was mayor much later.
Oh, was that right?
Yeah, he was an assemblyman.
Is it the same Polson?
Yeah, he was an assemblyman, and he was heading some kind of a committee investigating the State Relief Administration.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, and as a result of that, he and or somebody else who was the administrator refused to meet with the union and refused to meet with picketers and so forth. And so whoever was the leadership, I don't remember, and I was just kind of a follower at that point, we went up to the office and requested to meet with him. And he refused to meet, so everybody just walked into his office. Then they had a big thing there, the talk, and they finally got an agreement to meet with the union. At any rate, they took pictures of everybody that was doing this. The press was there, and it was a big thing. Finally, they terminated me. And as a result of the termination, I filed an appeal. And because I had the highest rating of anybody in the state State Relief Administration, and performance rating, and so I filed an appeal. I went down to the hearing, and the hearing had nothing to do with the performance at all. I was attacked there were other people up there who had done some of the similar things, who had filed because of performance ratings. But we were attacked by this guy that was the staff man for the Tenney Committee, or the Polson Committee, whichever one it was. We were just attacked by him from this platform. Weren't allowed to make any presentation, so forth. And then when that was over,
Polson was a municipal judge at that time.
He was?
And chairing these various activities.
Oh.
Yes.
That must have
And I begin to remember now. And because of his role as a judge, he was thought to be an impartial person.
Yeah. At any rate, that whole business was very unsatisfactory because I didn't say anything. Didn't just say anything. The fellow just attacked me and said that you were you went into this office and so forth without permission, and active in union leadership and so forth. It was a direct attack on the union. And so I left there, and subsequently I got a letter in which I was terminated for acts inimical to the public service. Well,
Have you got it framed?
Yeah, I was very fearful about that because I didn't know whether I'd get a job or anything. But later, when I had worked for the state again, the State Department of Hygiene, it never was a problem. And subsequently, it was so illegal and everything that was after they got through that period. The whole thing was kind of dismissed, I think. But that was an exciting period, and one where from the standpoint of social work, it was a very interesting period because on the one hand, I was very active in union. On the other hand, I was going to school, and I immediately joined the professional association, American Association of Social Workers, and also the American Association of Psychiatric Social Workers. And as a result, I was in the middle of this dialogue about whether unionism was professional or not. And that was a very interesting dialogue, and I had a lot of, I admired people on both sides of those issues. And because they were strong in their points of view, but they had good reasons on both sides. So I was in on a lot of meetings and discussions about those kinds of things at the time. Well, when I left there, I went to, I got a job at Vega Aircraft Corporation in the personnel department. because of my psychology background, and worked in the personnel department. And they were, shortly after I was there, they were absorbed by Lockheed. And I went to Lockheed personnel department, and in 1 year we went from 5,000 employees to 80,000 employees, and had to process all those. And because, somehow or another, because I had worked in the welfare activity and had a psychology background, they put me in charge of all of the service ends of things. So the health insurance and various things, I was dealing with all those questions, and I would deal with the employees, and what was really kind of an information thing. Employees come in with questions or problems.
So you had early exposure to social policy.
Right, I sure did. Then after that, I left there to take the job. I was very unhappy with that, because I saw what was going on. This was at the start of the war, and 41, I think it was. And I saw what was happening. It was such a boondoggle. And I got into the entire plant everywhere. And people, it was a cost-plus operation, and people were just ripping off the government. And the fellow that I worked for, the personnel manager, didn't know 1/10 of what I knew by that time. He had married one of the Lockheed Board of Directors' daughters, and so he was made the personnel manager. So he would have me doing everything for him, you see. So I was really, got very disgusted with that kind of job and exploitation. And so I had applied, taken civil service exams, and I got, finally, I heard from an appointment in a departmental hygiene as a psychiatric social worker. By that time, I had about a year's schooling, almost a year's schooling. And so I became the chief resident social worker at Baton State Hospital.
This is a continuation of the earlier interviews with Mr. Chauncey Alexander. This one takes place on June 24th, 1993, in the library of the School of Social Work.
Exciting.
Why don't we start back with your being at the UCLA Medical Center?
Right.
Tell me about it.
Well,
What you did there when you were
the,
there.
I left the Heart Association job after 13 years in 1967, and went to the UCLA Medical School for 2 years. And it was at that time that I was recruited by former president of the Heart Association and a couple of people at the medical school. And we were to initiate the regional medical programs. And that was a national program, federally financed through the states, in which there was the medical schools were given the responsibility for the development of new medical programs. So I was brought in as the associate director with Dr. Donald Brayton, who was the director of surgeon there, who'd been very active in professional education. He had done a lot of work in preparing television shows for doctors and how to diagnose patients and do all kinds of things like that. And So I was brought in to organize and plan the whole thing. So it was a wonderful mission, frankly, because it was the job to organize the community, to sponsor through the medical leadership new programs in healthcare. It was one of the Johnson thrusts. So what we did basically is I recruited several social workers to work with me. Al Toribio, you remember?
From whom I just sent a letter.
And eventually Lee Horowitz. Lee took my place at the Heart Association for about a year or so, and then came over to that program. And what we did essentially was recruit leadership in the medical profession in 9 counties and taught them how to do community organization work. And after I was involved with it and thought about it, it was a very smart operation because we took people who were close to retirement or retired physicians who were fed up with what they were doing, and they were more young, aggressive guys in hospitals. And we had districts in 9 counties, and we worked with them to organize community advisory committees, very broad-based, representing business leadership, labor, the usual lineup, minorities as civic organizations. And so it was a very, rewarding thing. It was tough moving those doctors from command operation to a persuasion operation. But we had regular training operations. And then what was involved was we'd have to write grant proposals and get them passed for money to support these particular programs. We organized such programs. We organized a major community health clinic in the San Fernando Valley, built around minority leadership in the valley. We organized the Martin Luther King Hospital and Medical School operation down there, with using what's his name, the black doctor that invented the blood.
Cannon?
No. His name is carried as the professional society for black doctors down in the Central area. At any rate, we organized local community committees, and then I had an overall committee for the entire region, which I was principally responsible for. But Al and I and Lee and so forth would go out, and with Dr. Covell and Nikki Covell, we would recruit these people and then put them to work, show them how to set up these committees, show them how to run the committees. And then we developed these various programs. We developed an education program for doctors, nurses, and social workers, in which we could, within 24 hours, put professional information on any problem which they wanted.
I looked at it just at the right moment.
Eyes, because my eyesight was so poor. I don't know why they took me in the first place. But at any rate, I went through that basic training, and then was out and couldn't find a job because I was used by the draft board to fill quotas. And I was drafted 7 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to find a job in social work. And, I'd worked for a little bit. First I worked for a few weeks with Family Service Agency, where I'd been doing my field work. And then I'd be drafted. And so that was a period of about 6 months or so in which I was either being drafted or being released from the Army, because every time I'd go down for an examination, the Army would turn me down because of my eyes. Finally, after the Battle of the Bulge, they started taking everybody in. And so I went in and went to Fort MacArthur. The first day I was there, a psychiatrist saw my background in the hospital and took me to work with him.
Hold on a minute. Okay, we still have a shoot feed.
And,
I don't want to lose that.
And that was Captain Phil Shapiro, who was a marvelous psychoanalyst, well-trained. His wife was a psychoanalyst. They were both from San Francisco. And he taught me a tremendous amount during that time. And we worked first for about a year screening people out of the service. Our job was to see the people who...
Before you'd been getting them in.
Yeah. And so our job was to screen them out, and we had a lot of interesting experiences there. Then we were transferred to set up the first psychiatric rehabilitation service and we went to Camp Lockett, and about 60 miles outside of San Diego, took over a big cavalry camp and set up a complete reconditioning center there. And Phil Shapiro and I were in charge of Phil was in charge, and I was doing most of
An oral history interview with Chauncey Alexander. It continues from side B of cassette number 2.
Let me go back and tell you something that I think that was significant. When I came into that job, there were lots of offers for blandishments. For example, I get things like this. I get a call from the CSWA. We'd love to have you go out.
All right, just a minute while I make sure it's still going. It's still running just as though nothing had happened.
Good. I'd love to have you go out to Hawaii. We're having a conference out there on gerontology. And we need you out there to participate. And I said, well, what is it you want me to do? Well, they say you don't have to do much. Just go there, and we'll have one of the programs where you can be part of a group answering questions and stuff. And I said, well, I don't know much about gerontology. I'm not an expert on that. Well, that's okay. We'll let you do that and so forth. And so I turned that down. And there were half a dozen of those kind of things at the council, the National Council on Social Welfare. Same thing. We had, and very specifically, I want to tie it into an end that has to do with today. There was the National Retirement Program you recall,
Yes.
for health and welfare voluntary agencies. So they had got a call from them. I was invited over to the Princeton Club, for a fancy dinner with several of their board members, and they wanted to recruit me for the board. So I said, well, let me think it over. And I went back pretty soon, and one of the things I did is to check, and NASW was the prime membership of the pension program. I found out that we were having all kinds of complaints about the program, the members, and so I said, so I went back to them, and I said, well, I'd like to help you out, but first we have some things to correct here. And so I said, here are some things, and I gave them a series of complaints that we had about people who were either not getting answers to their questions, or there were people who had applied for benefits and weren't getting them, and all kinds of things. And they said, oh, we take care of that. Just refer them right over to us, and so forth. And so I did. I had the staff over there. We kept getting these. Meanwhile, they had me to 2 or 3 of these fancy dinners of one kind or another, or some event. And so we kept getting the complaints. So I hired an accountant, a CPA, to do an investigation for us. I just went out and I got a recommendation of a top-notch person, and I put him to work, and I said, I want you to tell me everything you can about this organization. He came back with a report which was devastating. And it was the same old thing. It was the old boys there who were just milking the operation. They hadn't improved it in 20 years, and it was poor, inadequate benefits. The industry itself had gone beyond it. So I wrote a blistering letter to the board of directors about this, and I said, unless you correct these conditions, I'm going to pull all the NASW members out of this. And they fired the fellow who was the head, who was a kind of a stuffed shirt, and he was riding this thing. And they fired him and started recruiting for others. And they recruited finally a fellow named Bill Flynn from Equitable Assurance Company. And Bill came over to see me, and I talked about before he was hired, and I talked to him about what was needed in the job and so forth. And then they finally hired him. Well, Bill went in and really tore that organization apart, built it into, today it's one of the major national insurance funds in the country called Mutual of America. Mm-hmm. Mutual of America was the one that sponsored this Lifetime Achievement Award thing in my name, which they are giving. But it was, but that's the hookup with what was happening. There were a lot of those things that I had to get into, and so I began to see that I had to keep myself from being co-opted. So I was constantly having to be, pull back and be independent. Mm-hmm. And that made it very tough, because many of the people who were in this old boys and old girls club, there was Catherine Kendall and all those folks, and they had a kind of monopoly on the National Conference on Social Welfare and so forth. And that was going down the tubes too. And so I had to keep myself independent of those guys and just represent the interests of our membership right straight through.
It really required a lot of political astuteness as well as community organization skills.
Constantly. Yes. It was just the reality that, you know, that in the first place it was a thing which we had been complaining about for a long time, which was the East Coast control and domination of the whole thing. I'll tell you one other quick story to show you the kind of problem we were in. One of the things that the Urban Crisis Task Force, which was now running the organization in '69, had done was to give some money to a project in Mississippi that was headed by Wiley's outfit. Remember?
Oh, yes.
Wiley, the welfare mothers. And you remember, I don't know whether you remember or not, but we started that program. The local chapter gave Johnny Mae Tillman $4,000.
I worked with her because I was sharing the county department's commission on family and children set up under the Social Security Act. And she was a member of that.
So you remember.
So I used to hear a lot about it from her.
Well, our chapter gave Johnny Mae Tillman and the welfare mothers $4,000 to get started. And then it eventually became national. And so that was kind of a favorable spot for me to help, you know, because I at least had some connection there. At any rate, shortly after I came into the job, they were knocking on our doorstep for payments and for money. And we didn't have a dime, you know, I was borrowing money from the bank and everything else. And so I sat down, I finally said to Wiley, I said, we have to have a meeting with you guys, and let's get a lot of things straight here. So we had a meeting with Wiley and his board of directors, which was a group of mostly black welfare mothers. And they had 2 or 3 others. They had Tim Sampson. Remember Tim?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Well, Tim was one of his lieutenants. There was a young guy in there that was one of his 2 lieutenants. And Jim Evans, who later came to work for me in NASW, was one of them too. And so they came in yelling and screaming about the fact that they were owed a lot of money. It was called the Mississippi Project, and what they did was to send students into the area down there to try to organize people. And it was part of that movement, and they had apparently promised, the NASW had, in their usual fashion, they had been this way or that way. You know what they said. They did in effect promise them about, I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of $200,000 or $300,000, and to run this project, and had given them some money, but in the last year, since the organization was going downhill and didn't have the money, they had kept promising them, but they never said no to them. They just kept saying, well, as soon as we get some money, we'll do. So I had a meeting with that group, and I said, frankly, I told all of them, I told Wiley that we don't have any money, and you're not going to get any money. And I don't think that's the way our members' money ought to be spent anyway. And so, I'm sorry, we want to cooperate with you. We'll help any way we can. If you need to organize in the local areas, we'll try to get the chapters to help you organize. But we're not going to give you any money, and we're not going to support you or anything. Well, the top of a couple of the young guys and a couple of the women started in after me, cussing me up and down, you know. This particularly, there was this young fellow, nice guy, but he was trying to show off. So he was blistering me. So I turned right around and blistered him, and I knew more swear words than he did. Because I'd been there. And so that kind of shocked him and it stopped him. And I said, so some of the women who were more sensible said, well, your people are always being bad to us, mean. And I said, I'll make you this promise. If you have any of our members who treat you badly, or badmouth you, or do not do what they're supposed to do, you come directly to me and I will see that it gets corrected. And that kind of stopped them at that point too. But I said to Wiley, we'll cooperate with you, but we're not going to support your organization. We will be companions, but we will not be your donors. I said, we don't have the money, and if we had it, I don't think it's the right way to use it for our members. After that, our relationship with Wiley straightened out a lot better. He was glad to get somebody who was just honest with him and direct.
He knew where he stood.
Yeah, exactly. Knew where he stood. Before, they were frightened. They were afraid of him. And so they would kind of have promise and this and so forth. You know, that was the way so much of that developed. Just wishy-washy kind of approach. So that's some of the trials and tribulations of starting.
How long did you stay with NESW?
13 years.
15 years.
Well, and we initiated a whole series of programs. As a matter of fact, I have a little short write-up that I did about some of that. I'll send it to you.
Well, I think it would be very good to add to...
We started a lot of things.
All right, will you do that?
Sure.
That would be great.
Yeah. I just sat down and kind of wrote some of the experiences down, just to kind of keep track of it.
But you have an awfully good memory, and I heard names today that I haven't heard for years. So
I was thinking coming up here, do you remember Helene Lipscomb?
oh yes, indeed.
Helene was the one that hired me at the Veterans Service Center.
Yes.
And then later I took her position at the Mental Hygiene Society.
What other materials do you have that might be added to our record of your achievements? You gave me a CV. I have that already
have that?
on file.
I got about 4 boxes of plaques you can have.
Well, I'm hoping we can get that. Now, in this presentation that was made in Washington recently, did they record that?
Yes.
Is it possible for us to get a copy of that also?
I think so.
Because I think it would be a great addition.
Yeah. Okay. I think they can do it.
All right, that would be good. I told Bruce I would ask you so that we could round out their perceptions, and that would be fine.
Good. Sure.
And now you are teaching at Long Beach.
Right. Yes, I teach management and I teach social policy.
And are you there full time?
No, half-time.
Half-time.
Half-time. Then I'm active with this healthcare coalition in Orange County that I organized about 6 years ago. We have a big 65-member coalition of business, the same old
Yeah.
type. Everything from the junior league to the Asian.
Do you have some
Northern.
printed material on that, Chauncey?
Oh, yeah.
Could you send that along
Sure.
too, so that we
Yes,
can?
as a matter of fact, I have the original report that we did in '67, which we used to really sensitize the Orange County community to the fact they have big problems. It's been used extensively, and they have a follow-up report that we did on some of the things we've done as a body. And I was able to get 3 foundations to give money to hire staff, because I was doing all this staff work, and chairmanship and everything else for about 4 or 5 years. It was more than I could handle. So I got 3 foundations to give money, and we have 2 staff people now that run the operation. And it's been run under the auspices of United Way, but it looks as though we're going to go to a 501c3 and become an independent coalition.
Last summer, I think it was, I had a request from Corinne Wolf to do some biographies for the New Pioneers Room of NASW.
Oh, is that right?
And they wanted additional nominations, and I had sent your name in. Did they ever? Did you ever hear anything from
No,
them?
I've talked to Corinne a lot, and I submitted some names to her for that Pioneers program,
Uh-huh.
and I talked to her quite regularly.
That's, I had a telephone conversation this morning with Rhoda Sarnat, who's just come back. You know, the Sarnats are giving the NASW
Right.
funds for
I'm making a
prizes.
couple of nominations there.
Yeah, and so she went through the Pioneer Room and called me this morning, telling me she had found Al there and me there,
Is that right?
and various other people.
Uh-huh.
And I said, "Did you see Chauncey Alexander?" Well, she didn't remember, so I thought I'd better ask you. They surely have it.
I don't know. I haven't been through that room. Each time I've been there at the office, I've forgotten it.
I've not been there, but I'll check with Corinne. I'll be in Albuquerque next month. And I will see her in Santa Fe, so I'll ask her.
I did some writing for her, a series of recollections on her, for her biography, that somebody there at one of the universities was doing.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting. I read her biography and then responded, I guess, to it or something. Then they asked me about some of the people that she had worked with, what I thought about them and so forth. It was very interesting. I think I have a copy of her biography at home.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah. You know, I think I told you before that when we started this process at NASW, there are 5 or 6, maybe more, professionally done oral biographies of NASW leadership, including our dean.
Yes, I know that there's one of our,
You probably
we have
have.
a copy of that
Probably do have.
here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we got some money for that, and unfortunately, the board turned down continuing that project. I thought that was an absolute necessity.
That's too bad, because there's so much to learn
Yeah.
from.
Well, these people are dying off all around us, too.
Well, that's one reason we've been so eager to, we're going to, let me just close this off with thanks to you. and I'll expect to get these other materials. And now I can just chat with you.